This video covers the content of the SAP Cloud Platform Workflow virtual event, content which is available on GitHub. And specifically, it covers the content for exercise 3, which is all about installing and configuring the SAP Cloud Connector. In this exercise, we're going to install an SAP Cloud Connector in a container. The reason for doing it in a container is to have a consistent experience for all participants, and the prerequisites that are described elsewhere in this content list Docker Desktop as a required piece of software. So there's a number of steps in this exercise. The first one is to prepare the environment for the Docker image by downloading some resources and the Docker file itself, which contains instructions on how to build the image. We're then going to build the Docker image together. Once that image is built, and that image will contain the SAP Cloud Connector itself and the SAP Java virtual machine upon which it relies. Once we've got that image built, we've got to instantiate a container from that image and then connect to it to perform some initial setup of the SAP Cloud Connector. Once we've performed the initial setup, we're going to make the SAP backend system ES5 available. ES5 is a system that's actually available publicly on the internet, but we're going to pretend that it's an on-prem SAP system behind a firewall and connect to it from the SAP Cloud Platform via the SAP Cloud Connector. Once we've made that system available, we're then going to add a set of resources to be exposed from that system. Okay, so let's get started. So first of all, we need to create a directory, and inside that directory we need to create another directory called SAP Downloads. So the directory we want to create is container-scc. SCC stands for SAP Cloud Connector. And in that SAP Downloads directory we want to place a couple of files that we're going to download from the cloud section of the SAP Development Tools website. So we'll do that shortly. First of all, let me just flip these windows around so we can see things a little bit better. Now this assumes that the Docker Desktop is installed on your local machine, like here. I've got Docker Desktop installed on another machine on this local home lab network, so I'm going to SSH over to that and do it from there. There's no reason specifically for this exercise that I'm doing it over there. I just happen to have Docker Desktop on a different machine. You can do it just as well on your own local machine. I'm just going to attach to my session, and as you can see here, I've already created the container.scc directory. I've already created the SAP Downloads directory inside the container.scc directory, and I've already actually downloaded the 2 files that we're instructed to download by this exercise. But let's go through that now. In the cloud section of the SAP Development Tools website, which we'll go to here, we'll see there's a number of subsections. About halfway down, we'll see the Cloud Connector section. Now, the Docker image that we're going to build is a Linux-based image based upon the CentOS Linux distribution. So what we want, as instructed here, is to download the Linux-specific version. We want the latest version as well, which may be different to what's described in this particular step here. And in fact, as you can see, the latest version is 2.12.4. So we want this file, sapcc 2.12.4 linux x64.zip. So download that one. Similarly, just below, we want the SAP JVM, the Java virtual machine, because the SAP Cloud Connector is a Java-based service. Again, we want the Linux version, and specifically the .rpm component. Okay, there are different distributions of SAP JVM, and what we want is the latest version in RPM form, which is this one here. So if we look now at the SAP JVM section, we can see the latest version is 8.1.063, and that's the RPM version there. So what you want to download is SAP JVM 8.1.063 Linux x64 RPM. And as you can see, I've downloaded both those files already. Okay. There's one more thing that you need to bring into your local environment, and that's the Docker file. Now, the Docker file is a file of instructions that describe how an image should be built, and that Docker file is available in this particular exercises 03 directory. It's here. So I'm going to open it up in a separate window, and you can see it described there. I'm going to use the raw facility just to be able to grab that with copy paste. Let's just scroll back down again to the instructions. Okay. And as we can see, we're instructed to copy the contents of the Docker file into a file called Docker file locally. Okay, we could have downloaded this as well, but we're just going to do it this way. So I'm going to paste into that a file called Docker file. And now we've got a file called Docker file. Note, it has no extension. You can use an editor to create the Docker file if you wish, or you can do it the way I did it just now. So let's just have a quick look. You can see the contents there. Okay, so that's the end of step 1. As it's described here, we've got everything we need now to build the Docker image. If we have a look at what I've got on this machine as far as images so far, all I have is the base image upon which this particular Docker image is constructed. You may have no images. Because I've got this CentOS image already, the build will be slightly quicker. So, as instructed, inside the container SCC directory, we want to invoke a command. And that command basically tells Docker to build a new image called SCC based upon the contents of the current directory, i.e. the dot here. So the dot is important, so it can find the Docker file. This may take a moment. And there we have it. The image has now been built. Using this command here, we can just check the images again. The previous time I invoked this command, all I saw was the CentOS image, but now we have an SCC image, which was created just now, 22 seconds ago. Great. So now it's time to instantiate a container, which you can see as effectively an instance of that image. And we use the Docker command again to instantiate a container as follows. I'm going to clear the screen. Docker run -p 8443:8443. What that does is say, I would like the port 8443 that the Cloud Connector in this case is listening on inside the container. I would like that port to be forwarded and exposed to me on the machine where Docker is running, which is, in my case, this machine of SSH2. We want to give the container a name, myscc. We want the prompt to return immediately, i.e. we want the container to start running in the background. And the image upon which this container should be based is the SCC image. And what we get as output is an ID of the container. The parameters are described in a little bit more detail here. And now we can see if the container is running with Docker PS as described here. There we go, it's up. So at this stage, we're ready to continue with step 4 in this exercise to connect to the SAP Cloud Connector and perform initial setup. Now the instructions here are to open the browser and go to the Cloud Connector administration user interface at localhost 8443. Now if you are running Docker on your local machine, that's great, and that's exactly what you want to do, and that's most likely what you're about to do. Because I'm running Docker on a remote machine, I have to do something slightly different to these instructions. But before we go back to my local machine, let's just have a quick look at what ports have listening processes on them. And we can see right at the top here, listening on any IP address at the port 8443, we can see something is listening on this machine here. So that's great. That effectively is the SAP Cloud Connector inside the container listening on port 8443, which is being forwarded to the Docker host, which is this machine here. Great. So I'm now going to detach from this tmux session and log off. And now I'm going to open the equivalent of localhost. You'll want to use localhost because you're running the Docker container on your local machine. I'm running it on a remote machine, which is this one. So I'm just going to open this URL. Okay, great. So I'm just going to switch this across so we can see this a little bit better. Now, this may look a little bit alarming. What our browser is telling us is that we're connected via HTTPS, as you can see here actually. But the browser doesn't recognize the certificate that's being presented in this HTTPS context. But that's fine because we're in control of the service. So we can hit advanced and say, yes, we want to proceed to that particular service. And we're prompted to log in to the SAP Cloud Connector. Great. So at the login page, we want to log in with the default username and password. We'll then need to change the password. And then we're led through a wizard to connect the SAP Cloud Connector to an initial sub-account on SAP Cloud Platform. So we'll do that now. And in fact, let me just minimize this session. Let me split this off so we have the instructions on the left-hand side. The default username on a freshly installed SAP Cloud Connector is administrator. The default password is manage. So let's log in. So here we can see we have to change the password. And on saving our new password, we're now taken to a wizard that will guide us through connecting the SAP Cloud Connector to an SAP Cloud Platform sub-account. So, as instructed here in the exercise step, we need to specify the appropriate details as follows. So we have these mandatory fields to fill in: region, sub-account, sub-account user, and password. So these we can get from our trial sub-account home. So the bookmark you created in an earlier exercise, trial sub-account home, I'm going to open that now here to access my details. Now my trial sub-account is in the EU10 region, which you can also see reflected in the Cloud Foundry Environment API endpoint URL here, which is very convenient for us to look at. So first of all, let's specify the region. We can open up the selector, filter down to EU10, and we found it, cf.eu10.hana.ondemand.com. Now, we're connecting to this particular sub-account here, and for the sub-account, this is the ID of the trial sub-account, which is this here, 6197. So let's copy that and specify it there. Now I like to have the subdomain name as the value for the display name. The display name is not mandatory, but I like to put one in. And then these are your normal trial sub-account authentication details. So the login email address, and that should be it. While we're waiting for that connection to happen, let's just scroll up here, and you can see what we've just done is confirmed in an example here. And what we should end up with is a display that looks a little bit like this. So we have a connection status, connected, green. Notice at the moment it says no active resources available. That's fine, we'll deal with that shortly. We can see that the connector is connected to EU10, to this sub-account, and the connection was initiated by me. Great. So now it's time to make the SAP backend system available. Again, just to remind ourselves, we're connecting to a specific SAP backend system called ES5, which is actually available on the internet. So we could, of course, connect to it directly, but for the purposes of this particular exercise and the content as a whole, we're pretending it's an on-prem system and we're going to connect to it through the SAP Cloud Connector. So within the context of this particular connection, because the SAP Cloud Connector can connect to multiple target subaccount endpoints, and those will be then available here in this drop-down list. But within the context of the connection we have right now, we want to specify a new cloud to on-premise mapping, where we map a virtual system to an internal system. And this is described here in this step. So we want to use the plus button to add a system mapping. So what we're doing here is we're mapping a backend system, ES5 in this case, of type ABAP in this case. And we're going to be mapping it and having it available and exposed in our cloud platform subaccount, but we can also give it a virtual name to protect the real names of the machines on your on-premise network. Now, the ES5 system listens out for incoming HTTP connections using the HTTPS protocol. So we need to make sure we specify at this stage here, HTTPS. The internal host is the fully qualified host name of that system. Now that, in our case, is sapes5.sapdevcenter.com, but that could just be a simple host name on your internal network behind the firewall if you were running this SAP Cloud Connector on-prem. The SAP system ES5 listens on port 443, which of course is the standard HTTPS port. And now, as it says here, we get a chance to mask the real name of our on-prem system by giving it a virtual name. So we're going to use the name virtual ES5. And also we can mask the port. So we're going to give it a different port, 8000. For the purposes of this particular exercise and this content in general, we're not going to dig into principal propagation. So we'll leave that at none. And we'll also leave this setting as well. We don't need a description. And that's it. We could have used the check internal host here to make sure that host is reachable. You can do that, but if you forget to do that, or you want to do it again, you can also use this selection here, check availability of internal host. You can see the result there. Yes, SAP ES5.sapdevcenter.com on port 443 is reachable. However, if we have a look, we can see that it says still that there's no active resources available. We've mapped an internal system to a virtual system, but we have to take another step to say, well, given this particular system, we now want to specify individual URL paths or path groups to expose on that internal system. Some of you may know that standard SAP OData services often live within this URL path, and this is the URL path therefore that we're going to expose to give ourselves the possibility of accessing multiple SAP OData services if we wish. We also need to make sure to select the path and all subpath access policy so that anything beginning /SAP/OPU/OData is accessible. I'm going to save that. So now we should have a combination in the R access control of an internal system mapped to a virtual system, and within that mapping we should have this URL path and all the subpaths available. And we can see the message is now changed, that there are implicitly active resources available. The final step in this exercise is step 7, where we can check the connection at SAP Cloud Platform end. This option is available for feature set A based accounts. My account here is a feature set B account where temporarily the feature is not available. But normally you should be able to see in your trial subaccount home within the connectivity details a cloud connector section, and there you would see this cloud connector listed. So that's it. You've now got your own SAP Cloud Connector running inside a Docker container. It's connected to your SAP Cloud Platform trial subaccount, and it's also making OData services on that backend system, ES5, available. Thanks for watching.